Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming on a very hot afternoon. And in the next 45 minutes or so, we'll be discussing a very hot topic in the birding community. To feed or not to feed, that is the question. I have an extremely distinguished panel to introduce to you. We have in the middle, we have Will Peach, who is the head of conservation science for England and Wales for the RSPB, and he has stood in at the last moment to take over from Katie Jo Luxton, who was going to come. So in a moment I'll give him a chance to speak. We also have Nicholas Watts from Vinehouse Farm. He's been there for a very long time. He founded Vinehouse Farm Bird Foods. He was awarded an MBE in 2006 for services to farming and conservation. We also have, closest to me, John Mason, who's a writer and photographer of many years standing. Many of you will know him by his Instagram handle, which is The Early Birder. And so these are our panel. So what I will do, I will start with Will. I'll give him a few minutes to lay down the RSPB's stuff about bird feeding. Then I'll give Nicholas a chance to talk. And then I'll give John a chance to talk for a few minutes each. And then we will come to you, the audience, to ask the panel questions. Okay, so Will, I think you've actually got a video of a greenfinch to show first. Please, could we have the video?
Hard to see, isn't it? There is a tick greenfinch on the finger at the front there. And I'm afraid we're not going to see enough detail on this bird. It's got trichomonas, this greenfinch, and it's attempting to take the seed from the feeder. And what you probably won't be able to see, because we don't have the right light conditions, is that this bird is dropping seed onto the floor. It's taking the seed out of the port. Here it's mashing the seed up. Can you see that you can just see that some of the seed is sort of hanging off the bill. The reason it can't swallow is because the trichomonas parasite is in the throat of the bird, and the lesions develop within the throat, and sooner or later the bird is physically unable to swallow food or water, and so the response is to regurgitate the food either back into the feeder port or onto the ground, or if they're on the water bath, they regurgitate back into the water bath. In both cases, hundreds, thousands of viable parasites spread via the saliva onto the food or onto the water, and then of course you've got many healthy birds, uninfected birds coming in, picking up that discarded food or drinking at the same water bath, and they then become infected. So that was the point of the video. Next time we show it will be in a darkened room and you'll be able to see it. The reason the RSPB has revised its advice on feeding of garden birds is because of this disease and this transmission route. So feeding of garden birds is obviously a very popular and very valuable pastime. I'm sure we've all fed birds in our time, and it's really important, I think, form of connection between people and the natural world. My poor old dad, he lives up north and he doesn't get out much these days, but one of his favourite things is to see a blue tit or something on the feeder. It's one of his few genuine connections with nature. The reason that the RSPB has reviewed its policy is because really the main reason has been this very serious disease which is ripping through our finch populations in the UK at the moment. We've lost 2/3 of greenfinches already. We've lost about 1/3 of chaffinches, and bullfinches now are in freefall, absolute freefall. We've lost nearly half of all bullfinches in England over the last 10 years. For chaffinch and greenfinch, it's been proven beyond any reasonable doubt that the cause of the decline is this trichomonas parasite. For bullfinch, we haven't yet done the analysis, but it seems like the most plausible explanation for their decline. We see many sick bullfinches on feeders, and in places where the habitat is perfect for bullfinches, the birds are disappearing. At the RSPB's Hope Farm, which is an arable farm near Cambridge, we used to have 50 pairs of chaffinch. This is a farm on the edge of villages, so there are feeders nearby. We used to have 50 pairs of chaffinch. We now have 3. We used to have 8 pairs of bullfinch. We now have none. This is what Trichomonas is doing to our finch population. And so what's happened in the last year at the RSPBs, we've done a review of the evidence, looking at the benefits of supplementary feeding and also some of the downsides. And we've also been doing some research on the way this Trichomonas disease is functioning out there in our gardens and in the wider environment. And the review has shown several really positive things about feeding. So it's shown that if you feed birds in the wintertime, you are likely to substantially increase their survival rates. If you're putting out seed, for example, if it's cold weather, many more birds will survive through that cold snap. Probably none of you are surprised to hear that. But the scientific literature has measured that effect, and it's a huge effect. If you feed animal protein during the breeding season, perhaps mealworms, for example, there is a very good chance you will boost the breeding success of any insectivorous birds locally that are taking that resource. Again, the availability of suitable insects is quite often limiting, particularly in suburban areas, actually. So again, that's a positive thing that you can do to help your local bird life. And one of the other clear conclusions from our review was that people get an awful lot out of feeding birds. Okay? It's good for their mental health, it's good for their well-being, and particularly it connects them to nature. And particularly for people perhaps with limited mobility, like my poor old dad, or others who are in care homes or in hospital, seeing blue tips on a feeder and so on is a really important activity for them to take part in. Okay, so those were some of the positive signs of feeding. There were also some negative signs of feeding that our review unearthed, and there are various concerns about competition and so on between some of the species that have done well from feeding and others that interact with those species. And I'm not going to talk about that because I don't have time, but we can take questions on that if you want. But the main reason that RSPB has changed its advice is because of this Trichomonas epidemic that's affecting our finch population so badly at the moment. Those 3 finches I named are now in serious decline as a consequence of this. But we know all of the finches are affected. We see mortality amongst them, including hawfinches, and other species of great importance to us, like turtle dove, are also killed by this parasite. 2 bits of research are going on at the moment that have improved our understanding of how this parasite is working and how the disease is killing so many finches. The first bit of research was led by the BTO, the British Trust for Ornithology, and it looked for risk factors in garden situations where you're feeding birds, okay? Sort of trying to identify factors that might increase the chance of a disease outbreak in your garden. And 3 things they picked on was the numbers of finches that were coming into your garden. So if you've got lots of finches being attracted in by the feeders, you're more likely to have an outbreak. If you're putting out lots of different types of seed, you're more likely to have an outbreak. And there is a strong seasonality to this. So the outbreaks were much more likely in the summer and the autumn, so particularly the period from July through to October. Trike occurs year-round, but it peaks during that summer and autumn period. This parasite, desiccation in cold conditions kill it. Okay, so that's the reason you get less outbreaks in the winter. The second part of research that we did, we're trying to understand exactly how this parasite transmits. And what you would have seen there if we had darker conditions is that the main transmission route is from the birds spilling the food and the water. The parasite lives in the saliva, and so the sick bird regurgitates the seed is covered in saliva, and there'll be hundreds of live parasite on that seed. They can survive, if the conditions are right, for 5 days outside of the bird on that seed, either back in your feeder or on the ground beneath. And as you know, the seed that's on the ground beneath doesn't last very long. It's mown up by ground feeders, right? Pigeons and chaffinches and dunnocks and so on. So that is the mode of transmission. We didn't find any of the live parasite on the feeders themselves. Okay? So what this suggests to me is that feeder hygiene alone, cleaning your feeders once a week, even twice a week, won't be enough to deal with this problem, because the infectious agent is on the food and it's in the water. Okay? And one sick bird comes into your feeder, you could have hundreds of sick birds within a few days. Okay? That is why the advice that is being given online that this can be sorted out by improved feeder hygiene is incorrect, is wrong, and I think in several cases is deliberately wrong. It's disinformation, if you like. For this reason, the RSPB decided that the summer and autumn provision of seed was just too risky. Okay, there is a high risk that you're going to spread this disease and kill yet more finches by putting seed and peanuts out, the sort of food that finches will come and take in the summer period. Now, you might ask, well, why don't you extend this to the winter period? In the winter period, there's much less chance that this disease will spread because the cold conditions are killing it. And secondly, the benefits of putting seed out during the winter are much clearer. They are well documented. There is a real need, particularly during cold conditions, for the birds to have that seed. The same evidence for putting seed out in the summer is just not there. There have been rather few studies of the effects of seed provision during the breeding season, for example, on the birds in question. And the few studies that have been done have suggested either no effect of the seed on those birds, or actually negative effects. There was one very detailed study done on blue tits and grey tits in Birmingham area, showing that the breeding success of those two species was reduced when they were fed seed just before the breeding season. So the evidence that feeding seed, do the birds need supplementary seed in the spring and summer is just not there. Okay? So the RSPB is faced with this position. We have a very high-risk activity that many people, well-meaning people out there in the country are conducting during the summer and winter. There's no clear evidence that the birds need that seed. It's the season of plenty, right? The natural food should be there in most places in the environment. And it's a highly dangerous and highly risky activity. And for that reason, the RSPB has said, on the balance of probability, the balance of competing risks, it's too risky to feed birds seed at that time. Cleaning your feeders won't sort this out. Okay, so don't believe what you read online. We need other forms of mitigation. The RSPB is working on new designs of feeder that we think will reduce the risk. And that work's been going on for a while, and we're continuing it. And we may get to a point in a year or so where we'll have much lower risk feeders. For example, we're trying to intercept the seed that's dropped from the feeder in a vessel that won't make that seed available to other birds. That probably will reduce risk substantially. But for now, we feel we can't mitigate this risk, and therefore, given the lack of clear evidence for clear benefits of feeding at that time of year, it's better not to do it. Having said that, and remembering my poor old dad loving to see his great tits in the spring, we feel that the risks attached to fat and animal protein like mealworms are much, much lower, mainly because finches aren't coming whizzing in and out to take that type of food usually, and therefore in moderation those sorts of foods are probably low risk, and we would advise people to continue feeding in that way.
Okay, thanks Will. I think we're going to let the others have a go. So Nicholas, you have the floor.
Yes. Yes, well, I've been interested in wildlife since I was a toddler, and my father was a farmer and my mother came from farming stock, and so I took over my father's farm. And I found bird watching a little bit aimless, and so I started doing bird surveys. And first survey I did was for the PTO, Birds of Estuaries, in 1969, down at Old Beach Marsh. Went to count the waders there, And the first survey I went to, it was foggy. And all I recorded was 2 redshanks. But anyway, we moved on from there, and I started recording the birds on my farm in 1982. And by 1992, I realised there'd been a big drop in numbers. So I didn't know quite why this was. So I started feeding the birds in my farmyards. And so many came, it was a spectacle. And we had up to 800 birds in the farmyard at any one time. Small birds, buntings and finches. And I thought other people might like to see this spectacle, so we had an open day for people to come and see all these birds. And 2 or 3 people said to me, well, can you sell me any birdseed? You must be feeding them with some good stuff. And I was only feeding them on what I was growing. The next year we had the same spectacle, and again people asked me to sell them birdseed. We hadn't charged people anything to come to these open days. It was a free event. Anyway, so there I was selling bird food without even trying. My wife and I went to Argentina that winter, and farming and bird watching. And my wife took a fancy to some sunflowers with several heads on in the soybean crops. And I was dispatched through the fence to go and collect some heads. And we brought these seeds back and we planted them in the garden. And that autumn, the garden was alive with birds. We saved some of that seed and planted again the next year. And again the next year, the garden was alive with birds. And I said, we don't want to be selling people oilseed rape. We want to be growing and selling sunflowers. And so that's what we've been doing ever since. And our birdseed blossomed. But then I realised that perhaps what the real reason was, it was the summer time. Birds have to, it was so easy to feed the birds in the winter, but in the summertime, the birds on the farm have to go back to that dike or that hedge where they bred the year before. And so I thought, well, what they're missing is the weeds in the crops. So we started organic farming. And we've been doing that for 25 years, but it hasn't brought the birds back. And the reason being that we have to cultivate more when we're organic farming. And when you plough a field, you kill or 50% of the invertebrates are either killed or eaten. And if that keeps going on, eventually you get no invertebrates. So organic farming hasn't brought the birds back. So there's one other way, and that is to farm on a no-till situation, which 2 years ago we put one farm down to that, and we're already seeing results of bird increases. But so there we are, we're selling birdseed, and people liked our birdseed because we were growing it, and our sales increased, and then of course we get this horrible disease. And we can only, we don't do the research, the BTO and the RSPB have done the research, and we can only put out, you could say echo their guidelines to how to treat your feeders and your bird baths. But I realised that barn owls, we have up to 11 pairs of barn owls that breed on the farm. And if there's no voles, those barn owls don't breed. If there's a lot of voles, they breed, and they even have a second brood. And we've got, we had, in 2017, I ringed 1,000 young tree sparrows on the farm. And they were able to rear so many because they had a surplus of food. We fed them on red millet all the time. And yeah, I ringed 1,000 young tree sparrows on the farm. So to me, most birds that are declining are running out of food at some time in the year or another. But of course, then the question is, how do we feed safely? Okay? Yeah.
Thank you. And now, John.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to declare right from the very start that I love feeding birds. I was born in 1965, which happened to be the year that the Bird Table book was first published by Tony Soper. And he was my childhood hero. And I said that yesterday at the podcast. Tony who? He was my hero. And it was a real cottage industry, feeding the birds. I remember pestering my dad to buy coconuts so that I could cut them in half, and stringing out peanuts and making bird cake, and buying packets of Swoop. Remember Swoop? Yeah, Swoop. And you know, it was a wonderful thing. In fact, I would go so far as to say it inspired me to become a birder. I loved what was beyond the window, watching those birds. And in fact, I would take watching the birds in the garden at a bird table over the telly anytime. And still would. Cup of tea and a biscuit, wonderful. However, I've started to have, not doubts, because I still love feeding the birds, but it's how we do it. And I spend a lot of time on Instagram and so on, sharing what I do with my garden. And I'm a big believer in that actually it's making sure that our environment is rich in food for birds to forage that's actually the significant factor here. So for example, I've created a mini meadow. And this year it's been really interesting to watch the behaviour of the birds, because I have filmed goldfinches feeding on the knapweed seeds, the scabious seeds. We always assume it's just teasel, but they've been coming in for the unripe wildflower seeds. I've watched greenfinches feeding, and even bullfinches feeding on the wildflower seeds. Even more interesting was that we've had a pair of song thrushes. I thought we'd actually acquired a gravel drive. I got out of my car and there was a crunch underneath my feet, sounded very posh, and I looked down and there were snail shells everywhere. And I watched the song thrush going into the long grass and actually picking out the small banded snails and walking off with them to smash them on the tarmac. And so for me, I think it's very important that when we're feeding birds, particularly in summer, I never used to feed the birds. As a boy, it was something I put out my bird feeders in October. It was a ritual that I looked forward to, October half term. And I stopped feeding certainly by Easter. Now I realised that 1970s suburban London was a very different environment to the one it is now. Believe it or not, we had breeding lesser spotted woodpecker in the garden and spotted flycatcher in Harrow. It was a different world, I get that. But the thing is, I think we do need to think about how we sustainably feed and look at a more holistic view of the environment. The final thing I would say is climate change. Now, I live on the edge of the Chilterns. Last winter, it was extremely mild. I think we had probably 2 mild frosts. There weren't even hard frosts. And the food that we put out was left. Not only was it left, it was damp. Not because even it just was rained on, there was just a dampness in the air. So these giant feeders that, you know, were very difficult to take apart and everything else, I think our feeders need to be smaller, they need to be designed in a way that are really, really easy to clean. And we do need to embrace climate change in a more holistic view of how we feed the birds. That's me.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to the panel. We're now going to throw this session open to you, the audience, and we're very much hoping that you have some questions, because if you don't, we'll have to talk amongst ourselves. And I think a microphone will find its way to you. When you use the microphone, please hold it really close to your mouth so that we can all hear the question. And if you have anyone particular to direct it to, please can you say so? Yes. Hold the microphone right to your...
Oh, that's better. Yeah, no one in particular. I'm just wondering, when will the effects of not feeding the birds be better known? Will you know within a year that this is working, or and does it have a different effect on the bird population that you haven't thought of? So when will we know that this is all working?
That's a very interesting question. I think I might direct that. Remember, we've got Will in the middle, Nicholas and John. We'll start with Will. And can you please keep your answers as brief as possible because we do want to get to as many questions as possible.
Yeah, so from the RSPB side, we've got a program, we call it a monitoring and evaluation program. So we're doing regular repeat surveys of feeding behaviour from a representative sample across the nation. We've done 2 of those already. We'll be repeating those. We will be working with BTO to look at changes in bird populations and bird demography. And we will be doing local detailed studies on how suburban birds are coping in an environment with a variable amount of supplementary seeding. So that work's already begun. We plan to publish the outcomes of that on an annual basis, but it's going to be at least 5 years, I would imagine. But first of all, the behaviour change to kick in, and secondly, for us to be sure how the birds and the disease is responding.
Okay, I think that...
Hello? Sorry, second question.
Oh, a second one. Yep.
Sorry, no, not second, new question over here. So this may be a crazy question, but is there any thought of something like medicating bird baths? Is that even a possibility of a concept that could do to help if you have a lot of finches in your garden? I mean, I have a lot of birds, but not finches. But it seems to me like eat fish and medicating them is relatively easy. But I don't know whether we've got anything that can do that question.
Can I direct that at Nicholas?
Yes, you can put a chemical in your bird bath. I've no evidence whether that works or not. I don't have bird baths in my garden. We have a pond, and it's a bit more natural. But some people think that trichomoniasis was spread really by collared dogs in bird baths. And so if you have a bird bath, you should certainly keep it clean and should try the medication, yeah.
Will, do you have something to say on that?
The vets, we work with the Institute of Zoology, the vets who know about all this stuff, and although there are medications that can be used on captive birds, for example, you need a particular individual bird to have a regular dose. You know, it's like you taking your antibiotics daily for a week or something. And unless you can engineer a regular dosing of a certain amount, it won't deal with the infection. So the conclusion of the vets is medicating wild birds is completely impractical.
Okay, can we have another question?
Yeah, hi. With regard to your opening video, you've got finches there that you say are chucking seed down on the floor because they can't swallow it. I see this behaviour on my own feeders on a regular basis, and to me it's a survival technique. If there is one bird on a feeder and a sparrow hawk in the area, his chances are slim. If he chucks food down onto the ground and attracts 10 others, his chances are just increased of survival enormously. To me, it's a method of self-preservation.
John?
Well, it could be. I mean, if you've ever watched green finches eating, I mean, if you film them at feeders, most finches are messy eaters and very fussy, that I've found. If you put mixed seed out, they'll choose the ones that they want. And there may well be some sort of behaviour linked to that. Most birds are not very tidy eaters. So I just think that that's an observation. I don't know that it's a behavioural thing, but it could be interesting.
Well, birds are messy eaters because have you ever watched people choosing an apple in the supermarket, free flow apples? They're very particular which one they go for because when there's a surplus of food, you get rather picky, and so if you don't, you can see the people playing tennis. They get before they serve, they get 4 different balls and they chuck one out, and when there's a surplus of anything, you get rather picky, and yeah, that's what you're perhaps observing.
Okay, yep, the next question please. Well, there's loads and loads of people. So, this gentleman sort of nearest the camera, please. Keep them going.
Hi.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people in this room that will take on board the message that's coming across clearly now from the RSPB. But how do we get the message out to the general public?
Okay, that's a good question. I think I might come to you first on that, John, as a professional communicator.
I think it's just a question of persistence. I mean, people who get into a habit, we love, as I started off by saying, I love feeding birds, and of course we feed birds in a certain way, and I don't think we should stop. It was interesting to me that, of course, we love these sort of binary messages in the media, and they love to interpret things in a way as they stop feeding the birds, you need to stop feeding. Well, that's not actually what the message was. And I think it will be a case of over time the message will get across. It's not going to be perfect, and there will be people who will say, no, I want my bird table, and I want hang up my food all through the summer. That will happen, but over time, I think generally the message will get through, but it will take time. And I think it's just a case of keeping that message going, and the more people that adopt it. And as I say, it's really interesting hearing different perspectives. And so I find myself agreeing with everybody and going, yeah, that's an interesting point. It's not about great disagreements, it's about coming to a consensus and moving forward as a sort of general movement. So I think it will happen, but it will take time, and just being persistent with the message.
Nicholas, you have something on your website about some people will obey is the wrong word, will follow the guidelines, but that might make the other birds go to where they're not obeying the guidelines. So it will concentrate birds in the gardens where the guidelines are not being followed. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yes, well, there are people who are certainly not following the guidelines because they haven't heard what the RSPB has said. Others have heard what the RSPB has said. They like to see the birds in their garden, so they keep feeding. So it is a problem, and I think it could be that the message, it takes a while for the message to get through to the greater part of the public.
Okay, we have another question.
It's a question for Will, really. When we made the announcement about the change in feeding regime, we stopped feeding seeds and peanuts straight away and substituted mealworms and potballs. One side effect was we got a huge increase in jackdaws and magpies at the feeders. But what you didn't mention, you mentioned the problem with seeds and the substitutes, but you didn't mention peanuts. We were puzzled why, because we had lots of finches on the seed feeders, but very few on the peanuts, and we were just wondering exactly why are peanuts included.
It's a good question, and the reason that seeds were the top of the risk list is because that is the preferred food of finches, obviously. Mm-hmm. And what you want to avoid is large congregations of finches in a small area. That's a very high risk situation. If you go back to the days before seed kicked off in the UK, so you're talking about the 70s and 80s here, peanuts were a thing, but seed wasn't really. And there were studies going back, big published studies, showing that greenfinches, for example, were very partial to peanuts in those days. And I think the reason you don't see them on peanuts now is because they've got seed and they prefer seed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the reason why you don't see them on peanuts is because they have to work at it to get a bit of peanut out, don't they? Where they can pick a sunflower heart out of a feeder and don't like that one, try the next one, and that sort of thing. But sunflower seeds were never available to the birds in England. They're 25% protein and 40% oil, and it's too rich for them. If you were to go to McDonald's every day or a fast food outlet every day for breakfast, lunch and supper, you wouldn't last very long. You would get obese, or you would get diabetes, and all these, too rich a food is no good all through the year. And that's, perhaps trichomoniasis is a build-up of that.
Okay, thank you. On to the next
What's being done to approach supermarkets, big garden centres? Almost everyone that I go in still seems to have racks full of bird seed and feeders. It's hard to get the message across when people can see that at their local outlets.
John, do you want to?
Well, I mean, I agree. I do sort of see a lot of food out there, and I think, well, obviously that message has not got through, whether it's old stock or they've got feeders that they need to get rid of. And again, I think the only thing that's going to change that, people don't buy them. You know, they will sell what people buy, and they'll just disappear off the shelves eventually. And again, I think it's a case of time changing behaviour and habit. It's not going to happen overnight. I mean, I will add, in terms of the context of time, anecdotally, and I don't have any scientific evidence for this, but there has certainly been an uptick in the number of greenfinches locally, and I know that local people, we've stopped feeding the finches during the summer. There has been an increase in those greenfinches. Equally, what I've noticed is that buckets of food have been put out for farmland birds. Now, 2 years ago, I live in a very rural area, we had lots of yellowhammers, and we fed those yellowhammers. I'm not against supplementary feeding, but they were ground fed, and then all of a sudden they disappeared, and they were going to buckets that had been put out for them, and of course I guarantee that those buckets were not being cleaned. They were some green bucket feeders with portholes, and they were being shared with local greenfinch population and chaffinches, and I do the local farm and bird surveys, and the yellowhammer population has plummeted. Now that worries me, because to me it shows that there's a potential for an increase in birds, but also a catastrophic decline locally. And so again, I think these are the sort of things that we need to monitor, and time will tell. There are positives, but I think we have to be really vigilant.
So Will, CRSPB's stance on getting the message across to supermarkets and so on?
Yeah, so RSPB, before it announced its change in advice, had repeated consultations and discussions with industry reps, representatives. We did a webinar, we had individual meetings and so on. And some elements of the industry are responding already, but significant elements are not, and they're choosing to query the science. So I think, as John says, it's going to be a longer term discussion, and what we're talking about here is cultural change, right? Yeah. And cultural changes take a while to get going, I think.
The supermarkets are there to make money. They sell us all sorts of food that is bad for us. Yeah. In fact, I would say, are we doing to the birds what the supermarkets are doing to us?
Yeah. That's a very interesting point. Thanks for that one.
Sorry, one quick question. So could I ask your thoughts on mixed seed? Because I found that separating the seeds out into individuals in different feeders has slowed the amount on the ground, not stopped it. But is that a valuable thing to do? I don't know whether it's been that.
Well, I don't feed sunflower hearts. I feed a mixed seed, or I feed millet. And I believe that really it's sunflower hearts that's done the damage to our finch population. Our birds never had sunflower hearts. They never were available to birds in Britain. And in France and Spain, they were only available in August, September, October. And after that, the birds had to look for something, you could say, a little bit less nutritional, of nutritional value. So if you put out a mixed seed, well, the birds will eat other seeds. And I know they'll chuck some of them out, but it seems to be working in my garden.
I think the idea of putting different millets in different feeders, it would be an interesting idea, just as an experiment, to see which ones go down first. And I know that certainly putting out sunflower hearts, they started to ignore the Niger seed. The goldfinches were like, well, we'd like that stuff, but no, we prefer those. And you'd have a Niger feeder that we sat there for ages with the food, and it just goes mouldy in there, because they're just going, it's much easier, it's more tastier, we get more calories out of the sunflower seed. So it's an interesting experiment, and again, I think it probably would save on the mess.
Well, yes, the Niger seed, they don't eat the whole seed, they only eat the inside. And you could compare it with us like eating shrimps or lobsters. By the time we'd had enough food at breakfast of shrimps, it was nearly time to start lunch. But with lobsters, we'd get a feed in half an hour and would be available to go and do other things. And so that's why goldfinches left the Niger, because they could get on a lot quicker filling their tummies with sunflower hearts.
Okay, Tim, do you have a question? Since you run this thing?
Yeah. Can the disease be spread to small mammals, or is it confined to the bird world?
One for Will, I think, probably.
Yeah, birds primarily. You know, the concerns about sparrowhawk, to be honest, quite like this. Hawks are very vulnerable, goshawk and sparrowhawk, and it's quite. We're seeing a decline in sparrowhawks in this country, and it's quite likely that all this trike at garden feeders is affecting sparrowhawks as well.
Okay, Tim.
Mine is more of observation. When I started here at Rutland Water, many years ago, I could drive down the road and the car would be covered in insects. What are we actually going to do about providing natural food in the countryside for the birds that are not going to be fed? And it's something we've really got to think very carefully about. You know, farmers cut the hedges too early, so the berries go. The insects are so few and far between these days, and of course what the most baby birds get fed on, they get fed on insects. So I really want to sort of not necessarily open up the question, but also have a think. How can we get more natural food, either planting certain things in your own garden or in the countryside itself? When I first started, we used to ring 1,000 tree sparrows. We stopped feeding and the tree sparrows disappeared almost immediately. The adults would go down and collect insects from the water's edge at Rutland Water, whereas the adults would go and feed straight onto our feeders. So it's just an interesting thought. You know, it's all very good talking about what we're going to do in our own gardens, but where are the birds going to find all this food in a countryside that is very depleted of natural food?
I'll go to John on this one. We'll try and get as many questions in, so we might just go to John and then go to the next one. Obviously, we're trying to cover as much ground as we can.
I'll just say to him, I mean, just to reiterate what you've just said, what I've noticed about the local hedgerows is that they are cut really early in the autumn, very often when they're absolutely laden with berries and fruit, so that the birds don't get the benefit of that harvest. And also the verges, so all the seeds from the wildflowers have gone. And interestingly, probably the best way that our local birds were fed in a really dramatic way was when the local farmer, about 2 fields away, just left a field fallow and the weeds grew up. It wasn't a crop that was sown, it wasn't a bird food crop, it was just a field of weeds. And all of a sudden we had sort of clouds of linnets and corn buntings and yellowhammers and the various fat chaffinches. And it was an amazing experience for an entire winter just to watch them feeding on weeds, wildflower seeds. And again, I think that is the point I was making at the beginning, is that I love feeding the birds, but it should really just be a supplementary issue. And I have real misgivings when, as I say, I have a friend in Yorkshire who's lucky enough to have tree sparrows nesting on his house, and the birds fly down to the feeder and go back into the nest box. That doesn't feel right. They're being fed on even suet pellets or sunflower seeds. It doesn't feel right.
Okay, I know all our experts are itching to say something, but we will go on to another question.
Okay, yeah, just to follow on from that, I've stopped feeding in the summer. We've seen a significant decline in the bird population in the garden. Are we predicting that there's going to be just fewer birds overall as a result of this change? Because essentially the birds have disappeared. Are they going to breed as effectively without an artificial source of food? And how are we going to be able to do a really good scientific audit? You know, there's no point doing it in a garden. We've got to find a different way of auditing birds, presuming you do it, but how do we audit what this change is doing across all the species rather than just on the 3 finches you talked about?
Nicholas?
Yes, well, the birds have declined in your garden simply because you're not feeding them. They've gone to Mrs. Smith's garden, which is probably only 100 yards away, and they've gone there. So a bird flying at housetop height across the landscape, they can quickly see where feeders are, and they will home in on those feeders. Yeah, that's what I'd say. They've gone to Mrs. Smith's feeder. But certainly, by not feeding birds in May and June, you won't get so many birds reared in your garden. Our busiest time for selling birdseed is in May and June. We sell more birdseed in May and June than we do in January and February. And that's because the birds need it. But we've got to feed sensibly.
Okay, well, as you can tell from the last 45 minutes, this is a hot topic. Unfortunately, however, we have reached the end of our time. I'm sorry for those people who were unable to put their questions forward. There are obviously all three of our panel members are available through websites and so on, so you can ask them directly. But I would like to offer my warm thanks and the thanks of the audience to our fantastic panel, and please show your appreciation.